And we are go. And look, I've even got my microphone pointing toward me tonight. You can't say that I don't learn from my mistakes, which is why I'm so damn smart. It's because I make a lot of mistakes. Anyway, hi, good to see you. I'm Tad. You are who you are, and that is a perfectly good thing to be. Just ask Mr. Rogers. I was lucky enough to grow up not with Mr. Rogers because that was my younger brother's, but I was definitely around to see Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which those of you who grew up in America or anywhere where they showed Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood will know what I talk about when I say I was lucky enough. It was like having another really sweet uncle or something like that. Really lovely man. And Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, was just as cool in real life in terms of his principles and what he believed in as he was on TV. He was a lovely man, very very fine. Anyway, sorry, brief aside there. Just that just made me think of it because I was about to sing, the one of the Fred Rogers theme songs or something there, starting out. So what to tell? I do have my microphone on tonight. I hope everybody appreciates that. It's not. I've been better lately about not making weird mistakes, but every now and then. And I actually had the microphone hooked up and everything last night. I just hadn't brought it around from the side where I have to put it while I'm working on other things. So as a result, I was going talk, 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 and what you were seeing was talk, 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 and probably being really irritated and thinking there was some technical problem, and there wasn't. There was just Tad being stupid, which does happen. Don't ask me why. I just have sometimes the stupid switch is on and sometimes the stupid switch is off. So what else do I want to talk about? Not much really. I've had a busy weekend. Deborah and I went over to the old house today and did a bunch of stuff and saw some dear neighbors and another dear friend. And we're sort of still planning for how the rest of clearing out my folks' house is going to go. We've got almost everything out now. I think there's still like a bicycle and a giant ladder that I have to figure out how to get back to this side of the hill. And I can only carry one of them at a time. And I really don't want to make two 1 hour trips, 1 hour each way. But other than that, we're pretty much done clearing out the house. I spent a lot of as I think I mentioned last night, I've spent a lot of the last, yesterday particularly, a lot of it reading, because I'm doing a blurb for a new book, which I will tell you the name of, but that's all for now. It's called The Failures, and I don't know exactly when it's going to be out, but I know we had a deadline for the blurb, which I did squeeze in underneath. And it's a very good book, and when it comes out, I strongly recommend it. But I'll talk more about it when I have an idea of the actual publication date. And let me think, what else? So didn't have any chance to work today, just driving and cleaning up houses and driving some more. I am, of course, copy editing Navigator's Children, which is a great deal of apostrophe ranching and comma gardening. Comma gardening is in the sense that if I have a tick, TIC, if I have a tick as a writer, it is that I use lots of commas in my first drafts that I look at askance later on, or occasionally vice versa. I use no comma where I look at it in editing and go, maybe that needs a comma. But so there's a great deal of comma gardening, and there's a great deal of, for me, this is my particular thing, a great deal of apostrophe ranching, I guess for lack of a better word, because using the Scythi language and the Norn language in these books, which of course is, and what I'm doing is doing the last volume, Navigator's Children. That language has apostrophes in it as markers of certain sounds and things like that. But the problem is that I don't always remember to put them in, or sometimes I put them in first draft in places where they don't belong because I'm remembering from back when I first thought of the word and then later decided, no, it doesn't need that apostrophe, but the first 100 examples all have it or whatever. Anyway, as a result, I'm always looking at this and going, I don't remember how we spell this anymore and whether there's an apostrophe or not. And I have to frequently send out alarmed queries to the people like Ron and Ilva and Jeremy and Angela who helped me with my own lore, and say, what did we finally settle on? Is Anvijanya have an apostrophe in it, and things like that. Because of course my publishers on the other end, when they're copy editing, they can only go by what made it into the last book, but that doesn't mean that that was actually accurate. Sometimes things crop up in typesetting and stuff. Apostrophes get dropped, and I have to go out and round up a bunch of new apostrophes and put them back into the thing. That's the apostrophe ranching part. Sometimes your apostrophes go wandering out of the paddock, and you have to bring them back. Let me think. What else is there? I was talking a little bit about the admiration and envy I feel every time somebody sends me a good book by a new writer and wants me to quote on it. I don't have the time to do it for most. I did it for this one because it's very, very good, and there are also other reasons I won't bore you with right now, but as I'm doing that, while at the same time as I'm admiring another writer's work or enjoying another writer's story, there's also a part of me that's always like, well, that's another person I'm going to write a blurb for, and their books will be read for decades to come, and meanwhile I will just slip quietly into the shadows. I can be very dramatic with these things, Poor old me, now I'm just somebody who quotes for other people. I'm no longer on the cutting edge, and blah, blah, blah. And then I listen to myself for a little while, and I say, well, we are certainly feeling sorry for ourselves today, aren't we? And there's very few things that I dislike more than, well, bullies and narcissists are the two kinds of people I dislike most. And that smacks slightly of narcissism, that instead of just appreciating a new writer and appreciating what they've put in front of me and the fact that I have a chance to help bring it to other people, I'm going, well, poor old me. All I do now is, I'm everybody else's blurb and blah, blah, blah. And, the fact is, and I'm utterly serious about this, like, it's frickin' wonderful that people actually care about me and my name enough to want me to quote on somebody's book. I mean, that's wonderful. And it's the kind of thing I've told you guys before. I have many stories like this, and including one epiphany story, which if I haven't told you, I'll tell you sometime. But I have lots of stories like this where I catch myself feeling sorry for myself or just being a whiny jerk or whatever, and then I have to tell myself, you are, Lou Gehrig, the famous Yankees first baseman from the 1930s and 40s, was diagnosed with ALS, what actually got called Lou Gehrig's disease, because he was the first really well-known person to suffer from it, I guess. A terrible disease. It's the one that eventually took Stephen Hawking and made most of his life a very difficult time. And, it's a horrible disease. And because Gehrig had it, he had to retire early from baseball. He was one of the best baseball players that have ever been. He set a record for consecutive games played that lasted for 40 years or so or more. He was an amazing player, and he stood up in front of a packed crowd in Yankee Stadium because he played on the same teams with Babe Ruth and later Joe DiMaggio. And he said, the first thing he said when he was giving his goodbye speech about being essentially driven out of the sport by what his body had just collapsed at like age 34, and eventually the disease killed him not too many years later. And the first thing he said is, I am the luckiest man that ever lived, or something to that effect. I've gone blank on the quote now after this long lead-in, but it was basically, I consider myself the luckiest man who ever lived. Here's a guy who's leaving the sport he loves and who he's been one of the best ever at, because his body is shutting down on him through no fault of his own, just a weird disease, a terrible disease. And he can stand there and say something like that. Whereas, me, little setback or something, and I'm feeling sorry for myself and kicking rocks and, all that kind of stuff. So at moments like that, I just say to myself, perspective, Tad. You are blessed. You have been blessed your whole life with all kinds of good fortune. And you do something that you love doing for a living, and what are you complaining about? And I catch myself. and I right myself, and I metaphorically smack myself across the face a few times, and I get going again, or I try to. So anyway, that's where I am. And let me just take a sip here. By the way, I am not an influencer, so nobody's paying me. Just so you know what I'm drinking. It's not a skinny beer. It's Pellegrino water, but it's not they have a couple of kinds of Pellegrino water, and one of them is basically, as far as I can tell, is pretty much just water, which I don't need to buy in a can. But this one actually has some flavor to it, so I like it. I'm not good at drinking water unless I can trick myself. But that's what I'm drinking. It's not a beer. Not that big a beer drinker. Anyway, not that big a drinker, actually, but that's not anything to be proud of or anything one way or the other, just not. So I think I'm going to quickly check in and see who else has checked in. And so I see Anthony Merriman. Hello, Anthony. Good to see you. Medardo, mi amigo de Mexico. Deborah. That's a familiar looking name. Deborah Beale. I feel as though I've seen that somewhere before. I suppose my wife upstairs has put me on to see if I'm getting into any trouble. You know, I remembered to have my microphone facing the right way tonight, sweetie. I really did. Ron, my buddy Jeremy. There's Becca and Ray Weatherford. I think I pronounced it right this time. Barban, Tracy. Hello. Claudia, good to see you. Isaac, a pleasure as always. Tim. Hello, Tim. That's Tim Speckins. Kelly, Kenrick. Chris. Hello, Chris. That's Chris Borden. Carl Dersham. Christy Sanders. Susan. Shamlin. Penny Davies. Just to name a few. Oh, and Regina Lewis, who has got some hot green tea going on right now. Good thinking. Very good. Full of antioxidants. So, Medardo, I'm so sorry to hear that. Medardo says that his mother-in-law actually succumbed to ALS. Yeah, it's a terrible disease, and I still don't think they have. It was actually one of the things I considered when I was writing the Otherland books as something they might not have a cure for 50, 60 years up the road. And I settled on the disease that Orlando has instead. But ALS was one of the things I contemplated. Anyway, so I'm very sorry to hear that, Medardo. That's terrible. It must have been very, very difficult on you and your wife. So I am now going to start reading rather than spend all my time chatting, because I have done a lot of chatting lately, and it should be good to do some reading. There are cats in the room somewhere. They are slowly getting themselves used to my presence. And one of them has more or less completely accepted me and comes up and headbutts me for food and things like that. The other one, the one who was wearing the cone, and thankfully for her, thankfully for him, he has the cone off. We used to have one male and one female cat, and so whenever I have two cats, my first thought is he and she. No, they're both he's. Not that it matters. I mean, they can express themselves any way they want to, as long as they are comfortable in their gender. That's what I told them when they moved in. Anyway, where am I? Okay, so so you may see the cats in the background occasionally, and since they can't hear you, you're free to say anything to them that you want to. I have to be more careful because I have been known to be sarcastic with animals in the household, so I have to watch myself. I don't want to alienate them before we've had a chance to become really friends. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to open up the manuscript and read to you. What you missed last time, if you have not yet heard last night's reading, or early morning's reading, was that Jarnulf, Jarnulf is the mortal huntsman who was a former slave, escaped from Nakiga, the capital of the Norns, and has sworn a religious oath, essentially, to destroy the Norn queen and do whatever he can to bring down the thing. Anyway, he has found this party of Norns, among whom is Nezeru, whose adventures we have also been following. And he has started traveling with them. They think they're using him as a guide. He has his own purposes, at which he hasn't entirely formed yet, but he thinks there's got to be something strange about this group. So last time, Nezeru and Jarnulf have been kind of sparring back and forth. She doesn't really trust him. He can't quite figure out how somebody who seems fairly intelligent like her can be so indoctrinated in the Norn queen worship and everything. Anyway, during the course of events, one of her questions made him remember his childhood and various things that happened to him, most of them painful and unpleasant. The only exception to that being the fact that he was trained in martial arts, literally martial war, the arts of war, by a very distinguished Norn military expert for reasons that were described in the story. So, and it went through to more bad things happening to his family, and now we're back to present time. He's no longer reminiscing or recalling. "You have been silent a long time," Nezeru said. Jarnulf blinked his eyes. He had been staring at the way ahead without really seeing it. The great broad track the giant had made, the snow lifted on either side like a frozen ocean wave. "I was remembering something." "That I guessed." She truly was a strange one, this sacrifice. She had all but told him that she knew he had not tried to kill the Erkenlandish soldiers during their escape. He suspected that she had doubts about the arrow he had shot from the hillside as well. But at the same time, she seemed more curious about him than mistrustful. Hikedaya, as young as she was, hardly ever reached the frontier beyond Nakiga's inner borders, but the few that he had met were usually full of unshakable belief, not only in the Queen and the Holy Garden, but in the disgusting animal lowliness of mortals. What made this one different? Don't know if you can hear Johnny reacting to a food delivery upstairs. What made this one different? She was part mortal herself, of course, but he had lived with half-bloods in the slave barracks, and if anything, they had been more hateful to the other mortals than the pure-blood overseers had been. The Hikedaya had bred with humans all Jarnulf's life. It was not as common among the highest noble clans, and was virtually unheard of among the few oldest land-born families, but it was not unusual. What was rare was that a half-blood like Nezeru should reach such a position of trust at such a young age. Even mortal youths in mortal lands were seldom so honored. No, there was a mystery there, but without knowing more about her father and his place in the ranks of the Queen's servitors, Jarnulf could only speculate. And speculation, he had learned, was often the enemy of action. "All that is important is how she may best be used," he told himself, "because I am sworn to a holy duty, and I will not fail you, my God." "Do you not sometimes wonder at the tricks fate plays?" he said aloud. Her face at first seemed to hold only contempt, but he thought there might be a glimmer of something else there as well. Unease? "There is no fate," she said. "There are no tricks. I do what the Queen bids me to do. That is the only path, and if I stay on the path, there is no confusion, no tricks, as you would call it." "I speak of one thing, you speak of another," he said, then looked to make sure they were still well behind the others before he continued. "I speak of unlikeliness. You call it confusion, as if the world conspired against you. I will try a different path. How likely is it that you should be given such an honor, sacrifice Nezeru, to serve as a queen's talon, when hundreds upon hundreds of other sacrifices, older and more experienced, were passed over? You asked this before. I answered you. I earned my place. But if you are so valuable, so rare, why is it that your chieftain has punished you so savagely?" She darted him a look that was little short of hateful. "You know nothing of me, mortal, of any of us. I have seen your back, the scars you bear, They are not all completely healed. Do not fear, I was spying on you. The sight came by accident. You are very modest for one of your race. Most of your folk treat nakedness as nothing, perhaps because, unlike we poor mortals, you feel little cold. But you are different, Sacrifice Nezeru, careful, or perhaps only shy of displaying your wounds. Still, I saw them. Her face had gone quite pale. He thought she looked as lifeless as carved marble. I earned that punishment. I failed my duty. Still, you spoke once of your father as we rode a few days ago. He is always very busy now that the queen is awake, you said. I guess that he is an important noble in high office, am I right? She looked now as though she wished to get away from him. She truly was young, he thought. For all her bland exterior, for all the Hikedaya reserve, she had not entirely learned to hide her feelings. Jarnulf had long been a hunter, and Norns had long been his quarry, his prey. He could see her thoughts moving uncomfortably behind her rigid expression. Who are you to ask me questions? She said. Why do you not go and ask Mako about his father? Because then I would have to fight him, and one of us would die. Either way, it would diminish our chances in the dangerous lands ahead. But you are different than Hand Chieftain Mako. He knows nothing but what he has been taught, and he is content with that. You are not, although such confusion, that was your word, wasn't it? Confusion? Such confusion frightens you. That is plain. But why? Your questions are pointless and unwanted, mortal. In fact, I think more than ever that you mean some harm to this hand and its mission. Nothing could be further from the truth. I want this mission to succeed. And Jarnulf did not have to worry about hiding his actual feelings this time, because he was not lying. Next section. Despite the similarity of their faces and shapes to those of mortals, or even to that of the Hikedaya themselves, Vieki could never quite make himself believe that the Pengi, the Tanukadaya changelings, were much more than animals. The oldest builders in his order claimed to recall a time when even the lowest of them could talk, but it was hard to believe that now. And when he looked into the empty, cow-like eyes of the carrymen, currently standing beside the great capstan as they waited for a command from their overseer, Vieki found the whole idea even more incomprehensible. "Step into the cart, please, High Magister," said a voice behind him. "We have a long journey still to go." Vieki turned to the tall soldier in the silvery dragon mask. "Tell me your name again, officer, so that I may know who to blame if this adventure goes wrong." The guard inclined his head. "I am Hamaka First Armiger, Siesu. I am commissioned by the Queen herself for special service." Vieki looked at the soldier's surcoat, at the simple maze he wore as an insignia. "But you wear only the Hamaka helm, not the Hamaka crest. That is why I am called an armiger, High Magister." "Then who do you serve?" "Not Queen Utuku. We all serve the Queen, High Magister." "Just tell me who has sent for me, rousing me from my home in my hour of rest. If it is the palace, why are we not going there?" The guard's voice did not change. "I am forbidden to tell more than I have, High Magister. But you will learn all soon enough if you will simply step into the cart." Whatever his summoners planned, it was clearly not meant to be secret. Nearly everyone in his household, his wife Kimabu, his secretary, and many of his servants had seen the soldier and his labyrinth token waiting at the front door, the token that usually symbolized a summons to the Omeo Palace. But the messenger had stated in front of all of them that they were bound for somewhere other than the maze, and that none of High Magister Viecki's retinue could attend him. Kimabu had balked at this. That's right, it's not Kimabu, it's Kimabu. Kimabu had balked at this, of course, insisting her husband wait until more comprehensible orders were sent. But Viecki had weathered the deadly court politics of Nakiga for a long time. He was even a bit intrigued by such an unusual summons. Still, he did not like the wide, steaming vent that now confronted him, here, below the city, or the ancient cart and capstan, waiting to lower him even farther into the deeps of the great mountain. "I cannot believe the Queen would wish to meet me in such a place," he said. "The Queen is not here, High Magister," the guard said. "That, at least, I can tell you." "His Lordship Akinabi? High Celebrant Zuniabe?" The guard shook his head. "Please, High Magister, the cart awaits us." After a long moment's consideration, Viecki stepped into the mine cart. The dragon-helmed guard entered behind him and closed the barred door, then gave a signal to the overseer of the carrymen. The huge creatures, only slightly smaller than wild giants, began to crank the capstan. The massive ropes creaked as the cart shuddered down into the depths, past level after level, each a dark doorway into the roots of the mountain, where carrymen and other slaves dug for sulfur and gold. As the cart bumped and shook, Viecki felt the air grow warmer and ever closer until it pressed at his ears. There was something else pushing at him, too, a discomfort he could queasily detect just at the edge of his senses, but could not identify. At last the cart groaned to a halt, and the guard in the serpentine mask pushed the door open. "Go forward, High Magister." The queasy feeling had grown stronger. For the first time he felt real reluctance. "What about you?" "I have a passenger to carry back. Then I will return for you." The guard sounded impatient at Viecki's hesitation. "You must not fear, High Magister." Viecki got out and walked down the low passage. His trained eye told him it had been cut through the mountain long, long ago, or at least with stone tools, not metal or witchwood as used in more recent eras. The strange discomfort inside him grew stronger, as though he stood in the bow of a pitching ship. The heat of the place brought out sweat on his skin. He slowed, but that did not stem the sensation, so he silently said the prayer for the Queen's strength and continued forward. The corridor turned and bent, then suddenly opened out into a great cavern, this one untouched by tools of any kind, or so it looked to his practiced eye. Shifting red and yellow light turned the entire cavern the color of fire, and in its center a large crevasse belched steam and smoke, as though he were in some smaller version of the chamber of the well. From time to time, flames darted upward from the cleft in the stone, like the tongue of a hungry dragon. Other than that movement, the rocky chamber seemed empty, though the sensations of heat and oppression had grown ever more powerful. He no longer felt only a sickness in his guts, but something stronger, a kind of growing terror that clutched at his chest and dried his mouth and throat. What place is this? A cavern so far below the excavation levels? No builder had a hand in this, not in my lifetime. Viecki stared for long moments into the shifting light and clouds at the center of the chamber before he realized that a mote of darkness drifting high in the clouds of steam above the crevasse was something more. In fact, it had arms and legs and wore a billowing cloak. The tightening of his chest increased. His heart sped. "Have they hung someone there?" he thought in sudden shock. "Is this a place of execution? May the garden defend me. Was my family right to fear? Is that why I've been brought to this hidden place?" He stopped, unwilling to go closer to the pit, and the slowly moving shadow that dangled high above it. "I wonder how long he would fall if I pushed him in," someone said just beside his ear. "Would he cook on the way down?" Even Vieki, veteran of centuries in the conspiratorial darkness of Nakiga, nearly cried out in horrified surprise. He whirled, his hand dropping to the knife on his belt. Jijibo the Dreamer stood behind him. Utuku's strange many times great-grandnephew, his narrow face bobbing up and down. "Lord Jijibo, you startled me." Vieki's eyes turned helplessly back to the figure hanging so high above them in the wavering haze and orange light. "Who is that? Why was I brought here?" "Does he truly not know?" the Queen's kinsman said. "I did not think him such a fool. Does he not remember that I told him his family had been noticed?" And then, a moment later, without change of tone, "Yes, I would like to have a dried salmon for my meal today." Now Jijibo pointed a bony finger toward the dark shape floating high in the plume of steam. "Only look, Magister Vieki, the answer to both of your questions waits there." Vieki stared at the figure. "You mean that's not a prisoner?" "Oh, a prisoner, yes, most definitely," said the dreamer, "but not of the sort you mean. Yes, I do wonder what it would be like to flay all your skin from your body." In his previous encounters with Jijibo, Vieki had learned that it was best to pretend most of the things the Mad One said had not been spoken aloud, no matter how dire or shocking. "I still do not understand you, Lord Dreamer. Who has summoned me?" "I cannot stay to talk, noble Lord Vieki," Jijibo said with a touch of impatience. "One day, when we are dead, we will all smell like this. Did you know? The snake in the apple cart is waiting to take me back to my chambers. You see?" He grinned. The dreamer looked like something poorly made, his skin pulled a little too tight over his bones, his eyes a little too wide. Even his teeth were crooked. "Look at him frown," he said, "and he has not even met the Whisperer yet. How I would love to have that half-blood daughter of his. Oh, I would not take her skin off. No, too crude. How would I learn anything?" Finished with words, Jijibo then made a huge, exaggerated bow and strode off in the direction from which Vieki had come, presumably to the waiting minecart. Vieki watched him go, confused and disturbed by what Jijibo had said about his daughter. Only a moment later did he hear the other thing that the dreamer had said. "Whisperer?" he thought. "Does he truly mean, 'Our time is short'?" a voice said, and the shock of it made his skin crawl. This time the words were not spoken into his ear, but seemed to form directly in his thoughts. It was not the Queen's voice in his head this time, but something more strained and distant, as though it drifted to him down a long, long tunnel. "Ignore the holy fool," the voice continued, and the words felt harsh and dry as bits of drifting ash. "He is not part of what you must do." Vieki spun, heart racing even faster, but whoever had spoken was not behind him, nor anywhere in sight. Then a movement at the edge of his vision tugged his gaze upward once more. The dark figure in the billowing cloak was being lowered from the heights, spinning down slowly through the steam and flickering firelight of the great vent. No, not lowered, Vieki saw a moment later. There were no wires, no ropes, no noose. Let me try that again. No, not lowered, Vieki saw a moment later. There were no wires, no ropes, no noose. He had never seen anything like it, not from the great sorcerer Akinabe, not from Queen Utuku herself. "What do you want of me?" he cried, and was shamed by the frightened quaver in his own voice. As the robed figure drifted down to float just above the crevice, he saw that the face peering from the hood was featureless, covered in bandages, not even eyes or mouth left uncovered. Vieki shuddered. He knew now who had summoned him, but the knowledge did not slow his pounding heart. The shape stopped, drifting slightly in the hot air rising from the fiery crevice. A terrible aura of death washed over the Magister, not a scent, but something deeper, something beyond his physical senses, a terror that made his mind quail in disgust and fear. "I am one of the Queen's high nobles," he told himself, although he could scarcely think. He measured his breaths until he could summon the strength to speak. "Lady Amu, the Whisperer," he said, and even the name in his mouth was fearsome. "Great mistress, was it you who summoned this humble servant of the Queen?" For a long moment the faceless thing did not reply, and he was certain it must be listening to the terrified thundering of his blood. Even the Queen herself had never filled him with such dread. "Magister Vieki, I have watched you." The thoughts came in whispering fragments, as if carried on an inconstant wind, and scratched at his thoughts like the claws of rats. "From the wasteland of death, I have seen things even the Queen could not see as she drifted in the Yindra through the land of dreams and endings. I have seen your bloodline like a shining road leading to this moment and to all that will come after." Everything in him urged him to turn, to run, but Vieki forced himself to stand instead and answer that terrible whisper with the steadiest voice he could manage. "I cannot believe I am anything to you, great mistress, not to one of the Red Hand, not to one who has twice returned from the other side of death." "You are much to me because of the web of circumstance. Beyond death, I could see many things." Each word seemed to echo slowly through Vieki's head. "You are part of the great perhaps. Soon the Queen will give you a task, but your blood tells me that you have an even greater task to come, that of saving the Hikidaya race. Do you understand, little Magister? Vast things are now in motion." He bowed his head, not in piety, but because it was impossible to look for long at the unnatural light seeping from between Omu's bandages where a face should be. "Two tasks, but only one of them from the mother of all? I do not understand you, mistress." "No, you do not," said the whisperer, her voice like a wind from the loneliest place that ever existed. "You cannot. Remember this only. I have come from beyond death itself, from the shores of unbeing. I can tell only truth, and I say that to complete that greater task, a moment will come when you will have to choose." "What do you mean, mistress?" "To save what you love, you will be forced to kill that which you love even more. If you fail, all will fall to pieces. Your people, and they are my people too, will die and vanish from the world." Vieki felt suddenly helpless, sickened. "But why me, mistress? My blood is as nothing compared to the greatest of our people." The voice came at last, as thin as if it had blown to him from beyond the moon and stars. "You might as well ask why up is not down, or dark is not light. It is ordered so, and I cannot tell anything but truth. Now, leave me. I wish to bathe in the blood of the earth. I am cold here in your world, you see, so cold. Omu abruptly turned her back on him, the hooded robes swirling more slowly than seemed right. She drifted upward once more until she was only a spot of darkness, high in the wafting flames like a spider waiting inconspicuously at the edge of its web. Vieki did not bow, but stumbled out of the cavern as fast as he could, hurrying toward the minecart and the long shaft that would carry him back to a place that made better sense. His skin was cold as ice, his heart a loose stone rattling in his chest. The chief builder, who had spent countless years in the deep places of the earth, had never in his life wanted so badly to smell fresh air and maybe even see a glimpse of light from the true sky. Chapter 31, A High Dark Place. There will be wine, Astrian promised. Good wine. Captain Kenrick has promised to roll out several casks of Pedruan claret. That's worth an earful of boring soldiers' talk, isn't it? Because Morgan had not yet been able to pay Hatcher, the publican, they were ensconced in the Jackdaw this evening instead of the Quarely Maid, their usual port of call. Nothing is worth that sort of boredom, said Ulverus, ending his most recent silence. That's why I'm starting to get drunk now, so I can stand it until the Pedruan is opened. You make light of it, but Sir Zachiel deserves this honor, said Porto, frowning at them. The Order of the Red Drake is not one of your cheapjack trinkets given to anyone who can bow deep enough to impress the court. It is a warrior's honor. Will you truly not come, Highness? Astrian asked Morgan. It should be an amusing time. The prince shook his head. My grandfather will be there. Hell's hammers, both my grandfathers will be there. They will drink too much and spend the night telling old war stories, and they will both glare at me because I haven't been in any wars. That is nothing to be ashamed of, said Porto seriously. Rather, it is something to inspire gratitude. Easy for you to say, man. You've been to war. You've all been to war. That's the first thing anyone thinks when they see any one of you. Oh, there's a soldier. What's the first thing they think of when they see me? Ah, the prince. He's quite spoiled, you know. Just drinks all day and dices. Yes, but you drink and dice with us, the brave soldiers, Astrian said, smiling. That has to count for something. Morgan was not in the mood to be amused. The hard words he had heard from the king still echoed in his thoughts. No, I'm not going. The last thing I want to do is hear how the Erkenguard protected me from danger when the Norns attacked. I would have fought. It's not my fault I was forbidden to come out by the queen. It's not your fault, Astrian said. Nor are you the only one who missed out. I was on the mountainside, but only dodged a few arrows. I never even saw any of the fairies. But you've been in fights and battles aplenty. Nobody's going to think you're a coward. Nobody thinks you're a coward, Highness, Porto said. Ha! Everybody does. The nobles at court and the people in Urchester. Did you hear them when we rode in? Half of them were calling me Tosspot and Prince More Wine. I heard them. And the other half were cheering you, Astrian said. It is a known truth that the people are fickle, my prince. They are like children who do not know what they want. Offer them milk, they cry. Take the milk away, they cry even harder. Or piss all over you, said Ulverus. Just so. Astrian poured Morgan another cup. Go on, take this and warm your blood enough to come with us. You'll enjoy the evening." "No." Morgan pushed himself upright, then got to his feet, although not without a few adjustments. He did not actually feel very well, and hadn't all morning. Waking up with an aching head was not as appealing a sign of maturity as it had been a year earlier, when he had first begun drinking steadily with Astrian and the others. "I'm going to find something else to do. I wish you well, gentlemen. I hope Kenrick's Perdruin is as fine as everyone has said." He got up and started toward the door as steadily as he could, then remembered the royal guards who would be waiting for him in front of the inn. He turned back across the tavern toward the back door and the privy yard. "Our young prince is troubled these days," he heard old Porto say as he passed near his friend's table. Sir Astrian's reply was lost in the noises of a drunken argument outside as Morgan pushed the door open, but he did hear the others laugh. Morgan realized long before he reached the residence that the last thing he wanted to do was go to bed, but he had left himself with very little chance for company or diversion. Most of the Erkenguard were either at the Red Drake banquet or on duty. The keep's several guard rooms were empty except for a few old veterans nursing their bones in front of the fire, and he already owed money to the participants of the one dice game he found going on at the Nerula Gate guardhouse. "As a strategist, I'm a complete failure," he thought to himself. "Trying to avoid my grandparents, I have maneuvered myself into a night of boredom and loneliness." Even as he crossed into the castle's middle bailey, he could hear the festivities down at the town hall in Urchester. From the shouts and laughter and off-key songs floating on the wind, Sir Zachiel's comrades in arms were swiftly working their way through the claret. Most of the Hayholt must be with them, Morgan thought, because they certainly were not to be seen anywhere here. All around him the shops and houses were shuttered for the night. Morgan was still in the grip of a prickly anger that even the cool evening had not soothed, and for some reason the silence of the nighttime castle was nettling him more than the sounds of distant merriment from Main Row. For the third or fourth time since entering the Hayholt, he considered returning to Urchester, not to attend the banquet at the town hall, but to go in search of some less public entertainments. But though he knew the gate guards would be perfectly happy to let him out again, despite the late hour, he also knew word of it would eventually get back to his grandparents. A memory from his childhood poked at him as he made his way through the quiet, narrow streets, of an evening like this when everybody seemed to be somewhere else, a night when Morgan had found himself all alone, a midsummer's eve in the time just before his father had fallen ill and died. Young Morgan, 7 years old, had been recovering from warm water fever after spending more than a sennight in bed. His mother was ill with the same complaint, but where Morgan's only bedside companion was an old nurse named Clodagh, Princess Idela in her own chambers was surrounded by ladies in waiting and attended by frequent visitors. On that night, with his health mostly returned, the young prince had found himself bored and in a bad temper, so he waited until Clodagh had fallen asleep in a chair beside the bed, then dressed and made his way to his mother's rooms. She had been horrified to see him, certain that although he had just gone through the same fever, he would make himself ill all over again, and so Idela had made her ladies send him away. At a loss, Morgan wandered through the residence, desperate for distraction. Because he had been in bed so long, he did not remember it was Midsummer's Eve, and was puzzled and even a little worried to find everybody gone. At last he had left the residence and made his way across the innermost keep to his father's chambers in the old granary tower. A bit less of a tower than the name indicated, really more of a roundhouse built against the wall of the inner keep, and had turned out to be too damp to use as an actual granary. Prince John Josua kept the door firmly locked, and Morgan often had to bang on it over and over until his father finally heard him and came down, distracted and irritated. In truth, despite what he had told Porto, there had only been one time his father truly had not recognized him, and in his last year John Josua had always seemed so impatient to get back to his studies that Morgan had truly felt he might as well be some faceless servant. But on that night, in that strange, seemingly uninhabited version of the Hayhold, his father never came, though Morgan thumped on the heavy timbers until his knuckles were sore. At last, more out of annoyance than anything else, he had yanked on the door, and, to his astonishment, it swung open. With no sign of guards and no response to any of his calls, Morgan was caught between excitement at what was suddenly being presented to him after so many years of curiosity, and the knowledge that his father, who never let anyone into his private chambers in the tower, would certainly disapprove. But something about the oddness of the evening and his enforced and overlong bed rest had made him feel more adventurous than usual, and so he had climbed the tower stairs by the flickering light of the torches, ensconced at each landing, all the way to his father's chambers at the top. That door was also unlocked, which somehow confirmed in Morgan's mind the idea that he was meant by some superior power to keep exploring. So he slipped inside. A lantern was burning on one of the tables, as though his father had only just stepped out. After so many years of wondering what his father did up there, it had turned out to be a bit disappointing. Except for its great size, the chamber did not look much different than his father's retiring room back in the residence. Several tables and benches stood around the room, and every surface was piled high with heavy old books and musty ancient scrolls, and almost all of them seemed to be in use, propped open to a certain page or partly unrolled and then weighted by a smooth stone or another heavy book. None of the volumes seemed to be the kind that interested Morgan, like tales of knightly adventure or histories of war and other exciting subjects, and very few were even in a language he could read, so after a certain amount of perfunctory exploration, he went out again. If there was nothing worth looking at in his father's chambers, it was clearly not in his best interest to be caught and punished for the incursion. On the ground floor he had paused, distracted slightly by a certain clamminess to the air, unusual for summer, and also by the presence of an odor he could not identify, but which seemed quite unlike anything he had smelled outside or on the upper floors. To his surprise, he now saw another set of stairs that led down below the ground floor. He had missed them when he came in because they were tucked behind the stone spiral of the stairs he had just ascended. A kind of wooden frame had been set across them, not to keep people out, Morgan guessed, so much as to prevent someone stumbling into the dark stairwell by accident. He leaned over and breathed deeply. What came to him was not just damp, he realized, but something stranger, something that smelled old. He did not know precisely what that meant, but his curiosity had been seized, and he was just about to lift the wooden slats out of the way when the main tower door grated open, and he looked up in surprise to see his father's tall, angular form looming in the doorway. Prince John Josua had made a strange spectacle, swaying unsteadily, eyes wide with shock. "Morgan," he had said, and his words were slurred. "By God, boy, is that you? What are you doing here?" A scattering of rose petals were strewn in John Josua's disordered dark hair and on his shoulders, and Morgan remembered that it was Midsummer's Eve, that the castle was doubtless so quiet because most of the inhabitants were out celebrating at the bonfires along the Haycliff. Before Morgan could say anything, John Josua saw that the boy was leaning with his hands on the wooden gateway laid over the descending stairs. Before Morgan could speak, John Josua's eyes narrowed and his expression changed. "What are you doing? You are never to come in here, and you are never to go anywhere near those stairs. You could fall and be killed." Morgan had tried to protest, but before he could say anything, his father had grabbed him and yanked him away from the stairwell so forcefully that Morgan had lost his footing and tumbled to the floor. John Josua, all beard and hair and wild eyes like a madman in the street, had then yanked Morgan up onto his feet. "Never come in here again," his father had shouted. He smelled of wine and bonfire smoke. "It is too
Perilous for a child. Where are the guards? I'll have their heads for this. Is everybody around me a fool?"
Then, with no further words, he had carried Morgan to the front door of the roundhouse tower and set him down on the porch, then slammed the heavy door shut behind them. The two of them never spoke of that night, and by the time midsummer came again, his father was gone, and Morgan would never speak to him again about anything, at least not in this world. Another little break. He had almost forgotten where he was, wandering lost in memories toward the gate to the inner bailey, when someone spoke behind him.
"Look, Kina, it is our friend Morgan."
He turned to see little Snennek and his betrothed hurrying after him across the commons. Snennek had spread his arms wide.
"We were about to go back to our beds, but here you are. Did Binabik, my father-in-law-to-be, send you to find us?"
Morgan sighed. "No, I was just out walking." Snennek smiled broadly.
"I did not think your people ever did this, unless it was necessary for them."
"Walking?"
"Going out of doors. Your people are seeming to hate it. It is the one thing I least understand. Kina has said the same. Is that not right?"
"Perhaps because of smelling," she suggested.
"Smelling?"
As usual, Morgan had been with the trolls only a short time, and already he was confused. But in his unhappy, half-drunken mood, it did not charm him the way it usually did.
"Oh, because your people throw their amak and kukak right outside their homes," Snennek explained.
"Yes," Kina said, nodding, "into the land river." Morgan could only squint, completely lost. "Land river?" Snennek and Kina conferred briefly but vigorously in Kanuk.
"In the street," she is meaning. "The foulness is thrown into the street."
Morgan shrugged. "It's a city. That's how it is in cities." Snennek nodded.
"And those who have wealth are making others to clean it away, so their own house does not have such the kukak smell. But in other places it is piling high."
"I don't really want to talk about kukak," Morgan said. "I don't really want to talk about anything. I was on my way back to the residence, to bed."
"As we were? But this is a lucky meeting, I think."
Snennek smiled his broad yellow smile. One thing Morgan had to admit about trolls: they seemed to have all their teeth.
"Because I had questions that I had hoped for answering."
Morgan felt a strong need to silence his unhappy thoughts. "I will answer any questions if you have some kang-kang. Do you?" Snennek showed the yellow grin again and pulled a drinking skin from inside his hooded jacket. Morgan took it and allowed himself a long but still cautious swallow. He had learned to drink the stuff, but it tasted like tar water, and too long a draught would send him to his knees coughing and sputtering. However, it had the sovereign benefit of working swiftly. As he wiped his lips, he could already feel the warm kang-kang glow in his stomach, working its way back up toward his head. He sucked in a breath, felt the inside of his mouth tingling. "Questions?" he asked.
"Kina's father, Binabik, has been very busy," said little Snennek. "Not much time he has given to showing us your, what is the word, village? Town?
City. Yes, Urchester is a city. Almost the biggest in all of Ostenard, in fact. Most of the time he might be heartily sick of what Urchester had to offer, but he did not want it compared unfavorably to some trollish campground in the freezing mountains. "City. Just so." Snennek nodded. "And so we have questions. The first one is, why does everyone here go inside at night? Even in Mintahok, where the cold winds blow, people visit each other's caves." Morgan didn't have an easy answer for that. "Tonight many of the guards and nobles are at a celebration in Urchester City,
But the rest of the time, well, that's just the way people do things here. Because the streets are dark. I mean, it's not so much that they're dangerous, especially not here in the castle, but people here don't. Ah, because streets are covered in amak, said Snenek, clearly pleased to have the answer at last. Your people are not visiting after dark because they do not want to walk in the filth. With certainty. Now another questioning, if you are so kind. Morgan didn't bother to correct him. Streets were just empty at night, that was all. More kang, he said instead. As the oily, burning liquid ran down his throat, he found himself growing less concerned with the ruin of his evening. Perhaps there were still ways it could be salvaged. And we're going to stop there because we've got a long section of stuff happening in the next bit. So I am going to hang it up there for the evening. I hope you have all had a good evening yourselves, and we'll have a good rest of the week. I will be back Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, next Sunday once more at 1 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Oh, and again at 7 p.m. also the same. And I will continue reading the Witchwood Crown, and we will find out what it is that Morgan decides to do with little Snenek to salvage his evening. And let me see, what else is there? That's really about it. So I'm going to hang it up, as I said, and I'm very glad and very grateful that you have joined me and spent some time with me. So thank you very much. And now I urge you to take very good care of yourself until we are together again. Take good care of your friends and loved ones. And whatever extra energy you have left over, check on your neighbors and whatnot, because as long as we all help each other, we will all have a much better shot at making it through this entertaining but somewhat frightening game of life. So with that, I say peace and thanks again, and I'll see you very soon. Ciao.